You're listening to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence, and I've had the opportunity to interview many of those who are making a difference at the intersections of yoga and health. And I'm here to share with you their stories and conversations. Thanks for listening. In today's episode, I interviewed Rebecca Weisman. Rebecca is a devoted student and teacher of Iyengar Yoga, and her classes are a dynamic mix of anatomical exploration and energetic experience with a focus on bringing the mind to a deep and quiet state of absorption. I love that, by the way. She's a certified Iyengar Yoga teacher level 3 and a certified yoga therapist, and she's also the director at the Iyengar Yoga Center of Vermont. Rebecca also teaches prenatal and postpartum yoga, and she has a particular interest in therapeutic and medical applications of yoga asana, the postures, and pranayama, the breathing exercises. She's worked successfully with individuals in private and group classes on many issues, including fatigue, depression, chronic illness, chronic pain, lower back pain and sciatica, hip, knee, and shoulder problems, recovery from injury, anxiety, blood pressure, and immune system disorders. She has a new book, Yoga for Pelvic Floor and Postpartum Health, that she co-authored with Megan Satinsky, and we're here to talk about that and more on the podcast today. It's so great to meet you and have you here today, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd love if we could just start by having you share a bit more about yourself, where you live, how you came to yoga, and how your work evolved to what you offer today.
I live in Vermont, and I started doing yoga at a very young age. I was interested in yoga at a very young age, both the physical practices and the philosophy. When I was in my 20s, I started to have some chronic health issues. And I really looked to yoga to help heal those issues. And I found that, like most people who live with chronic pain, there's a mental component to that, a psychological component to that. So I found that the yoga really helped address not only my physical symptoms, but also my mind. And one of the things I experienced when I was a young person was pelvic floor pain and bladder pain. I was diagnosed with interstitial cystitis, which is a bladder condition. And it was very challenging as a young person to be experiencing that level of pain. When I first started doing yoga, I tried many different kinds of yoga, and eventually I landed with a teacher who was Iyengar based and really introduced me to therapeutic yoga. And she really helped me heal both physically and mentally, and opened my eyes to how healing yoga can be. And of course, all yoga is therapy in a way, but the Iyengar approach to therapeutics is a whole field of study in and of itself, a wonderful field of study. And I got really turned on to that. I really enjoyed doing that work right from the get-go. As I progressed in my practice, eventually got certified as an Iyengar teacher and studied therapy, yoga therapy with many people, I really wanted to help people with both very specific chronic issues as well as addressing the mental challenges that come from living in pain.
Great. So it sounds like this passion that you have to work with others around pelvic floor health came from your own personal experience. What about the postpartum piece? Is it that they go hand in hand, or did that come to you later in life through your own experience?
After I had my first baby, I was really surprised at the physical symptoms that I was experiencing. the pain that I was experiencing. And I was also very surprised at how surprised I was as somebody who had at that point been practicing yoga for almost 20 years. I felt, oh, I know myself, I know my body, I'm very empowered in my body. And I realized that I really didn't know very much about the pelvic floor and about what was really going on there. And as I began talking with colleagues and students and friends, I realized that many of us have no idea what's going on in our pelvic floor and our pelvis in general. I started teaching some postpartum and pelvic floor classes with Megan. And through those classes, we learned a lot. Megan is a physical therapist, and who specializes in pelvic floor work and has also been a student of mine for a long time. And so she brings a more clinical experience to the courses. And in our discussions with students, we found that many students didn't have an outlet and didn't have the correct support from their medical team. And a lot of times our conversations would start with a student saying, well, maybe this is too much information, but, and then they would tell us what they were experiencing.
I've done it myself.
So through these courses, we really learned how to work with a variety of different issues. And I just felt that if I, as somebody who is an Iyengar Yoga practitioner, don't have the knowledge, how is maybe just the average person who knows nothing about anatomy, has never studied anatomy, how are they going to understand anything about what they're going through? So we really started the courses as a way of empowering people to understand their own anatomy, to understand the postpartum process, which is actually quite a long process, a long healing process, and to really kind of destigmatize this part of the body and the postpartum period as something that many people have challenges with, many people struggle with.
So I imagine that the courses that you ran sort of evolved into the book that you and Megan co-wrote, Yogic for Pelvic Floor and Postpartum Health. You've touched on this a little bit already, but I'm curious, what do you hope that your readers get out of the book? And who do you hope to serve particularly?
We really want folks to feel empowered. We want folks to read the book and learn something about their body and learn something about how they might use yoga to, I'm going to put this word in scare quotes, diagnose themselves, because I don't mean that from a necessarily a clinical perspective.
I understand.
But more as a way of, Megan and I refer to it as understanding your pelvic floor landscape. And if you can understand something about that landscape, not only can you use the yoga more effectively to help yourself, but you can also feel more empowered when you go to seek help from others, whether that's a physical therapist, whether that's a doctor, that you can have the language and have the basic understanding of yourself so that you can speak for yourself. We hope to serve both folks who are postpartum, but we also have had many students in our classes who are struggling with pelvic floor symptoms and conditions who are not postpartum. And we've always gone back and forth over the years, should we really have a separate pelvic floor class that's separate from the postpartum class? And we always end up putting it back together because the approach is the same in a sense. The approach is the same in that we're starting with very, very basic building blocks, feeling, sensing, understanding what's going on with your pelvic floor.
And I mean, obviously there's probably a lot of women who take in this work and are drawn toward it, but I believe you even speak to men in the book, don't you?
Our courses are open to people of all genders, and we've had people of all genders in our courses. In the book, We try to use language that's inviting, that's inclusive. We do address some, I'll say it this way, sort of biologically male anatomy versus biologically female anatomy. Whenever we start to discuss anatomy, terms like male and female become really tricky. We like to say that the book focuses primarily on organs associated with giving birth, like the uterus and the vagina, although we do have some information that is geared towards people who don't have a uterus and who don't have a vagina. We also believe that the work on the pelvic floor that centers really around the musculature, quite similar from person to person, regardless of gender. So the practices in the book might be beneficial for anyone.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I could tell it was really thoughtful. So there is quite a bit of anatomy in your book, which is really helpful. I don't see this as so much in regular anatomy books or in yoga books, right? And here you are kind of putting that together. And I'm curious if you could just share a little something out of the book or out of your work that you've and experience that you've come across. What's often not known about the anatomy of the pelvic region that you hope to educate with your book and with the coursework that you offer?
This one's so tricky because there's so much that we're excited about. First of all, I want to just give a big shout out to Megan Satinsky, my co-author, who worked so hard and diligently on the anatomy for this book. And she's very meticulous in her approach to anatomy, which you can tell when reading the book.
Yeah, you can.
One aspect that I think is very helpful for people to understand is the idea of tension in the pelvic floor. And we'll often get students who say, oh, I was told I'm weak in the pelvic floor and I need to strengthen, or I'm tight in the pelvic floor and I need to relax. And Megan goes into this in great detail. She does a great job of explaining what tension really is. And it's not so simple as I'm this or I'm that, but understanding tension, understanding tone, and how to feel in your own body. And Megan gives a great description of how to do a personal assessment on yourself and how to start to feel in your own body areas of high tension or low tension, and that there can be many different things happening at the same time. One of the things we talk a lot about in the book is how to work with the breath. So overall, the anatomy that we present, while it is very technical in some ways, we also try to make it very experiential so that you can read the anatomy sections and then really try to feel in your own body what's going on.
That's great. It kind of leads me to another question that I'm curious about. Do you find, since you're working with a lot of yoga practitioners, that some of the misinformation about the pelvic region comes from yoga practice in a way? Does that ever factor in something that needs to be relearned? I'm thinking of bandhas, etc.
So it's a great question. I tend to think about practices not as being right or wrong, but as being effective or not effective. So what's good for one person might not be good for another person, or what was good for you in the past might be not good for you in the present.
Sure.
So we try to listen to each student and try to hear in what they're saying, what the issue is, to try to kind of help them investigate and get to the bottom of the issue. And sometimes that takes a little bit of unlearning, but perhaps all yoga is a kind of unlearning of our patterns, our habitual movements, our conditioning.
Yeah, well said. In addition to going into such great detail with the anatomy, there's lots and lots of asana sequences. And then you also go into special topics such as cesarean birth, which has been my experience, so I was kind of drawn to that. Diastasis recti, another thing that I have in my personal experience. Postpartum depression, that too. I'm curious if you can speak to one of these special topics and what support folks might find for it in your book.
One of my favorite of the special topics is the section in which we talk about incontinence, which is very, very common. Again, big shout out to Megan for her contributions to the clinical discussion of these sections. One of the things that we discuss in incontinence section has to do with the variety of different types of incontinence. So again, we can't just say somebody has incontinence, so go do this pose. It doesn't work like that. It's, okay, you have incontinence. Here are some things you might want to consider. Here are some things that you might want to investigate, trying to understand the reason why you have incontinence, because it could be different from person to person. And then in those special topics, we have a section that says approach to asana. And that approach to asana refers back to the previous sequences. It refers back to the previous poses. And it really is that. It's an approach. So it's not a prescription. And again, we really want to empower people to understand their own condition, to understand the asanas, and then to apply the asanas in a way that is most effective for them.
I so appreciate that. You know, at the heart of yoga therapy is the individual, unique person. And so what you're describing to me, even in the approach that a book is taking, right, which is a book is different than a session with a yoga therapist, but it holds that same spirit of really honoring the uniqueness of each individual that is seeking care.
That's so important for us to convey. We really hope that that comes through in the book.
It's been amazing to learn a bit about you and what's in the book. Anything else you want to share about it or the work that you're doing with Megan?
Just to check out the book, share it with your friends, share it with your community, talk to each other, talk about issues that are coming up. We really want people to feel empowered.
That's so great. Well, finally, and I like to ask this question of each of the guests that come on the podcast, I'd love to just kind of have a little more insight into what your personal yoga practice looks like. We teach that to be such an important part of doing the work of a yoga teacher and certainly a yoga therapist is to first be really steeped in your own practice. And that comes before you can adequately serve others and hold space for others. And I just kind of love to learn a little bit more about your personal yoga practice so that it might help inspire others.
My daily practice is probably about 2 hours. On good days, I have 2 children. Sounds like you have children as well. Mm-hmm. So you know how that goes. But on good days, it's around 2 hours. And each day is different. What I love about Iyengar Yoga is its ability to teach us how to adapt to changes in our bodies, changes in our mind, changes day to day. So one day I might have a very energetic practice, and another day I might just be standing in Tadasana for half an hour and observing. So it really changes. Sometimes I'll take on a therapeutic issue, especially if it's something that I'm personally feeling. I also, like most Iyengar practitioners, spend a great deal of time studying. My main teacher is Patricia Walden, who I've been studying with for many years, and I study directly with the Iyengars. So I'm constantly studying. I also may choose to have a day where I'm immersed in philosophy. I love to read yoga philosophy, and I find that that goes in phases for me, where I can read a lot in one sitting, and then maybe it takes me some days or weeks to integrate what I've read. And I think that the philosophy is really important. It's important in my teaching, learning how to apply that philosophy in our practice, our asana practice, our pranayama practice, meditation practice.
It sounds really comprehensive, Rebecca, and thank you for giving us a view into that and sharing with our listeners all that you do. And I hope that folks do feel empowered by reading your book and learning from you. Thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you'd like to learn more about who we are and what we do, visit us at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.